Good afternoon, Year 8. Welcome back. I hope you had a lovely half term. It's nice weather, wasn't it? I hope you managed to get out and sit in it a bit, or play in it a bit, or whatever. I imagine you're all sitting there nice and brown. I know I am. So anyway, nice to speak to you all again. Today this over the next half term, we're going to be looking at Dickensian characters. Some of you may have heard of Charles Dickens. He was a Victorian writer. Rather than look at a whole novel, we're going to look at some of his characters. So without any further ado, you'll do now is, based on the pictures here, which are all drawings of Victorian London, what do you think London was like in the 19th century? Just write 3 or 4 lines on that, give you 5 minutes, and on to the next slide. Okay, into your books. The title is An Introduction to Charles Dickens. I wish I'd had this at school. It took me years to discover Charles Dickens. So your title is An Introduction to Charles Dickens, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to try and understand the background and the influences that his background had on the writing of Charles Dickens. So write that title into your books, just the title, not the learning objective. Today you're going to need a pen, a pencil and a highlighter, a PDF copy of Charles Dickens' Literary Lives, which will be attached to class charts, and your exercise book. So the do now, your response might have been something like, was it polluted, industrialised, divided? It certainly doesn't look like a great deal of fun for most people, does it? I think we can agree on that. Okay, throughout this half term, coming up to the end of Year 8 for you, you'll be exploring the work of one of Britain's most prolific writers. That prolific means he wrote a lot. Charles Dickens. We'll be focusing on the characters he creates. He's created some incredibly memorable characters. Oliver Twist is one that everybody knows. We'll be focusing on the characters he creates and the lives that they lead in a very turbulent time period. Today's lesson is going to introduce you to the man himself, Charles Dickens that is, as we try to figure out who he is, and what drove him, what motivated him, what type of a person he was. So you don't need to write any of that down. Just inwardly absorb and go on to the next slide. Attached to class charts is a PDF of a document called Charles Dickens' Literary Lives, and I want you to read it and respond to the following questions using evidence from across the whole text. What evidence is there that suggests that Charles Dickens was a successful author? How did Dickens' childhood experiences impact on his later life? And what are your impressions of Charles Dickens? Was he a good man? I'll give you 15 minutes to do that. That doesn't include the reading. It may take you a bit longer with the reading. Here are the questions, and here are some answers. They may be the ones that you've got. What evidence is there that suggests Dickens was a very successful author? He's still admired and respected today. I expect most of you have heard of him, even if you haven't read any of it. He wrote several books, lots of which are very well known. He toured America and Europe in his lifetime to give readings, and that was something that was a much bigger deal then than it is now. Even Queen Victoria enjoyed Oliver Twist. How did Dickens' childhood experiences impact on his later life? Well, he had that idyllic childhood, didn't he, up until the age of 4. Then it all went wrong, and Dickens' father was in prison for debt. And as a result, Dickens had to quit his education, going to a nice private school, at just 12. He had to assist his family in a boot blackening factory. That means you're spending the whole day in a probably boiling hot, badly ventilated factory blacking boots. I'm not entirely sure what that is, but it sounds like making boots black, which I would imagine is very messy, smelly and incredibly boring, to help his family. And this was very traumatic for him. He went from this idyllic life in a private school, and he was obviously a bright boy and liked learning, to boot blacking all day. For many of his works deal with poverty and social injustice as a result of his own experience. So he saw how people had to live, and it's only through luck that he didn't live that way, or that we don't live that way, and it gave him an empathy to people who were having to do those jobs and didn't have the benefit of a lovely education. So what are your impressions of Charles Dickens? Was he a good man? That's obviously your own opinion, but you may have referred to his philanthropic works. That philanthropic works means works for charity. His relationship with his wife and mistress, and his belief in mesmerism. There you are. When you've done that, and if you haven't, if you see one of those on there that you think you can add credibly to your list, then do it, and then go on to the next slide. Right, throughout this unit, we'll be covering four main ideas that appear through Dickens' work. Social inequality, that's just people, I say just, that's people being born into situations of poverty that they can't escape from. No social mobility. Industrialisation, you may have heard about the Industrial Revolution when the UK went from basically a farming country to an industrial country. Villains and innocents through five of Dickens' most famous works. A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, Hard Times, Oliver Twist, and A Tale of Two Cities. Fantastic books, one and all. So your task over the next part of this lesson aims to give you a brief overview of society in the Victorian era. So I'm doing this on a PowerPoint, so it's going to be slightly jerky, those of you that are looking at it on YouTube. But nevertheless, that's the way it is. I want you to make notes in your books, pausing the video to ensure you don't miss out on anything. Now, there's quite a lot here. You don't have to write it all down, but I want you to write down what you think are the most important points, and that's going to be a lot of them. And then I'd ask you, as you have been doing, most of you, if you can, I know it's difficult for some of you, to send me your work. I'm going to read out these slides, and on the video and on the PowerPoint you can stop it wherever you need to make some notes. So, social inequality. In Victorian England, the majority of people were poor and many were destitute. That means it was worse than poor. They simply had nothing. There was no welfare state. Children died. People lived 4 families in one room, sort of in each corner. The average life expectancy at this time was 29. Like, you couldn't expect to live past 29. A minority were wealthy enough to live in decent houses, have regular meals, and pay for a doctor when they were sick. So it was most people didn't live past 29, didn't have an education, and had thoroughly miserable lives. And it was only a small amount of people who could have regular meals and pay for a doctor when they were sick. There was no NHS, obviously. If you were sick, you had to pay. The wealthy lived side by side with those who were living in poverty. London was very crowded, and areas like Knightsbridge and posh places like Chelsea would rub up right against places like Battersea, where people lived who were very poor. Many wealthy Victorians believed that the poor were lazy and had no sympathy with them. Does that ring any bells? We see this attitude in Scrooge when the charity men asking for money. I can't afford to make idle people merry. Charles Dickens, because he'd fallen on hard times and had to go and work in that bootblacking factory, knows that you can be poor and it's not your fault. Other Victorians are very concerned about the plight of the poor, Dickens among them. Industrialisation, which is factories, people starting to build factories, machines that could make things that stopped people having to make them, and they made them much more quickly. Especially in the textile manufacture, that's making things out of cloth and so on, and other products to be sold cheaper could be sold cheaper in Britain than anywhere else in the world. Transport links were improved with the building of canals. We used to move everything about by canals. That's when these links like the Basingstoke Canal and the Grand Union Canal were all built, and the invention of the steam train, but that was sort of coming up in the background. They had to sort of build all the railway infrastructure. This was a time of unprecedented growth. England had never before or since grown in this way, and it was fantastic for the economy, but as we've already noticed, it didn't benefit everybody. Now, in 1834, sort of a third of the way through the Victorian period, a thing called the Poor Law was passed. Now, each parish, and the country was divided up into parishes, people were very religious in those times, money or clothing and food was given out to the poor, or if they were desperate, poor people could go into the workhouse. So people would, give out, a bit like food banks really now, people would give out money to people and clothing to help poor people who didn't have any money. If you were in debt, you were put into debtor's prison, and as we saw earlier on, Charles Dickens' father ended up in debtor's prison and only got out because he inherited some money. I mean, putting you in prison because you're in debt suggests that you're going to prison for, well, probably forever, because how could you possibly earn any money in there? But he was lucky, and he inherited some money. But in 1834, the law changed so that money and clothing could no longer be given out. You could not give money and clothing to poor people. It was against the law. So the poor had to go into the workhouse or receive no help at all. Now, workhouses deliberately kept conditions worse than the lowest paid independent labourer would experience to encourage the poor not to work. So going into a poorhouse because you've run out of money was not something you'd want to do, because it was so horrible in there. You wouldn't want to be in there. You were quite often separated from your families, and it was just mind-bogglingly grim. And this law forced people to go into the poorhouses. You could not give charity. So if you went and gave money to a beggar in the street, that was illegal. That's what the Poor Law did. So there were riots in the north about this, protesting about the new Poor Law, which condemned the law to a life of misery separated from their family. Well, Year 8, be glad you weren't born back in Victorian times. Infant mortality was common. You might not have even made it to the age you're at now. So although families had lots of children, many of them would not survive until adulthood. In 1840, a third of all children died before their 5th birthday. A third died before their 5th birthday. There was no state education, so most children were not taught how to read or write. Huge numbers of children were sent to work from as young as 5 or 6. They would work in factories or do street jobs like road sweeping, which is brushing the road so that the wealthy can cross without getting dirty. In London alone, there were estimated to be 30,000 children who lived on the street with no one looking after them. Street crime was rife. So that's the milieu, the context that Dickens's writing arrived into. So the working people would rarely enter a bookshop, and so hawkers or travelling salesmen took the books to where they gathered. People were interested in reading if they could read. There was no other education, no other entertainment. You couldn't watch television or go online or anything. So books and pamphlets were of great interest. But as it says here, working people didn't go into bookshops. They probably wouldn't be allowed in. So hawkers or travelling salesmen took the books to where they gathered. Dickens was one of the first authors to take advantage of this, publishing his novels in monthly instalments which were cheap to buy and small enough to pass around. Other technological advances added to the popularity of reading. Electric and gas light meant it was easier to read after dark. Train journeys, which promised a smooth ride and lighted carriage, were a perfect time to read and publish. And publisher Routledge started a railway library with books that were portable and priced at just £1 each. Okay, and just a little task to finish with. What are your expectations for the novels we are going to look at? What do you think they're going to be like? They're not going to be science fiction, are they? And what do you think was life was like during this time? So write a couple of sentences, full sentences, responding to those questions. And that's us for today. So we've got a bit of an idea now who Charles Dickens was, what type of a person he was, how he came to be in the position that he found himself in as a writer. And thank you for that. And I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.